begins with a moment no one in that courtroom could ignore. Not from a witness, not from investigators, but from the evidence itself. Footage, a delivery truck, a child alive. 7-year-old Athena Strand standing inside a vehicle she should never have been in. Jurors would later see it. Investigators would never forget it. Because in that moment, this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was something else. Something irreversible. Tonight, we follow the disappearance of Athena Strand and the investigation that revealed what happened in the hours after she vanished. This is Unsaid Case Files. November 30th, 2022. A quiet evening in Paradise, Texas. A rural property, open land, scattered trees, the kind of place where nothing ever seems out of the ordinary. 7-year-old Athena Strand was home that evening with family. Earlier that day, everything had been normal. School, routine. Nothing to suggest that this night would become anything more than just another date on the calendar. At some point that evening, Athena was asked to do chores, something later reported by family members. But like many kids her age, she didn't want to. Instead, she went outside. And on a property like this, that wasn't unusual. There was space to run, room to explore, plenty of places to hide and play. For a while, nothing seemed wrong. No noise, no signs of distress, no reason to believe anything had changed. But as time passed, something did. When it was time to come back inside, Athena didn't. At first, it didn't trigger panic. She could have been hiding, wandering nearby, just out of sight. Family members called her name. They checked around the house, looked across the property, searched the places she would normally go. But she wasn't there. And with each passing minute, the situation became harder to explain. Because a child doesn't just disappear, not from her own home, not without a sound. And as daylight faded into night, what started as a routine evening was becoming something else entirely, something no one there was prepared for. When law enforcement arrived, the situation was already shifting. A missing child, rural property, night approaching. Every minute mattered. Officers began coordinating an immediate search. They moved across the land surrounding the home, calling out her name, scanning tree lines, checking structures, fields, and nearby roads. Neighbors joined in. Flashlights cut through the dark as more people stepped in to help. At this stage, investigators treated it as what they hoped it might be: a child who had wandered, gotten lost, hidden somewhere nearby. But as the search continued, something didn't add up. There were no clear signs of where she had gone, no indication she had simply walked off and kept going. And in cases like this, investigators begin asking a different set of questions. Who was here? Who had access to the property? Who came and went, even briefly? That's when one detail stood out. Earlier that day, a package had been delivered to the home. On its own, it meant nothing. A routine stop, a normal part of the day. But now, it became something investigators couldn't ignore. Because timing matters. And this delivery happened not long before Athena was last seen. Authorities began tracing it, looking into delivery records, driver information, route logs. It led them to a name, Tanner Lynn Horner, a FedEx contract driver who had been on the property that same evening. At that moment, he wasn't a suspect, just someone who might have seen something, someone who might help answer the question no one could yet explain. What happened to Athena Strand? Because somewhere between that delivery and the moment she vanished, something had changed, and investigators were about to find out what. Investigators moved quickly to locate the driver, Tanner Lynn Horner. At first, the interaction was routine. He confirmed he had been on the property, delivered the package, then continued on his route. When asked if he had seen anything unusual, he said no. No child, no interaction, nothing out of place. On the surface, it aligned with what you might expect from a normal delivery. But investigators didn't stop there. Because in cases involving missing children, nothing unusual isn't enough. They began verifying his timeline, reviewing delivery data, looking at route logs, checking the sequence of stops. And as they worked through it, questions started to form. There were gaps, moments that didn't line up cleanly, time that couldn't be fully accounted for. Individually, small details, but together, enough to take a closer look. So investigators pushed further. They requested additional evidence tied to the delivery vehicle, including any available camera footage. And when that footage was reviewed, everything changed. Because inside the truck, Athena Strand was there, alive, visible on camera inside the delivery vehicle after the stop had been made. That single piece of evidence did more than contradict his statement. It redefined the entire case. This was no longer a search for a child who had wandered off. This was now an abduction. And the man who said he saw nothing had been the last person seen with her, alive. From that moment on, the investigation shifted, and time became even more critical. Once investigators confirmed what was on that footage, everything changed. The search for a missing child became a race against time, because now they knew something critical. Athena Strand had been inside that truck, alive, which meant there was still a possibility, however small, that she could be found. But only if they moved fast. Law enforcement worked quickly to locate the driver again, Tanner Lynn Horner. This time the approach was different. He was no longer just a potential witness. He was now the focus of the investigation. Officers located him while he was still out on his delivery route. He was stopped, detained, and taken into custody without incident. Body cameras recorded the moment. What had started as routine questioning was now something far more serious. And at that point, one question mattered more than anything else. Where is she? Because despite everything investigators had uncovered, there was still a window of hope. The footage proved she had been alive after the delivery. And in cases like this, that timeline can mean everything. Inside the vehicle, on the road, somewhere between stops, there was still a chance. But time was slipping. Every minute without answers made that chance smaller. Investigators needed the truth, not pieces of it, not delays, not another version of events. They needed to know where Athena was, and they needed to know now. Because the man sitting in custody already knew. And what he said next would determine everything that followed. Inside the interrogation room, everything slowed down. No chaos, no raised voices, just investigators and the man they now knew had been the last person seen with Athena Strand alive. Tanner Lynn Horner sat across from them. At first, he stayed with his original story. He talked about his route, the delivery. Nothing unusual. But investigators already had the footage. They knew that wasn't true. So they confronted him with it. Carefully. Directly. A child inside his truck. Alive. The room shifted. Silence stretched. And slowly, his story began to change. What started as denial turned into admission. He acknowledged that Athena had been in the vehicle, that he had taken her. And then, the part investigators were hoping not to hear. He told them he had killed her. According to investigators, Horner admitted to strangling Athena after abducting her. The focus of the room changed instantly. Because this was no longer about what might have happened. Now, they knew. But one critical piece was still missing. A confession explains what happened. It doesn't tell investigators where. And without that, the case wasn't complete. Athena still hadn't been found. So investigators asked the question again. Where is she? Because even with the truth finally starting to come out, there was still one thing they needed to do. Bring her home. By this point, the investigation had reached a critical stage. Investigators had a confession. They knew what had happened to Athena Strand. But knowing wasn't enough. They still needed to find her. Inside the interrogation room, the focus narrowed to a single question. Where is she? Tanner Lynn Horner began providing information, directions, landmarks, details about where he had gone after taking her. There was no time to waste. Officers moved quickly, coordinating with search teams and following the information he provided. They traveled to a rural area along a roadway, an isolated location, away from the property where Athena had disappeared. As they arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Officers spread out, scanning the area carefully. Every step measured, every movement deliberate. Because this was no longer a search for someone who might be found alive. This was about confirmation, about bringing her home. And then they found her. 7-year-old Athena Strand had been located. The search was over. For investigators, it marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Because from that moment forward, the focus would turn entirely to the case, the evidence, the timeline, and ensuring that what happened to Athena would be fully accounted for in a courtroom. But in that moment, standing in the dark at the end of that search, there was only one reality that mattered. She wasn't coming home. Once Athena Strand was found, the investigation entered a new phase. The search was over. Now the focus turned to building the case. Every detail mattered. Investigators began organizing everything they had gathered, piece by piece. The timeline came first. From the moment Athena was last seen, to the delivery, to the footage inside the truck, to the location where she was found. Each point had to align. Each moment accounted for. Then came the physical evidence, the delivery vehicle, the recorded footage showing Athena inside, route data confirming where Tanner Lynn Horner had been and when. And finally, the confession, what he told investigators, how it matched the evidence, and where it confirmed what had already been uncovered. Because in cases like this, it's not just about what someone says. It's about whether the evidence supports it. And here, it did. Investigators reconstructed his movements, mapped out the gaps in his route, identified the exact window of time where everything happened, from abduction to the location where she was left. By the time they were finished, there were no major unanswered questions, no missing pieces in the timeline, only a clear, documented sequence of events. And with that, the case moved forward, from investigation to prosecution. Because what had been uncovered in those hours after Athena disappeared would now be presented in court, and every detail would matter. As the investigation concluded, the case moved into the legal system. What had been built in those early hours, the timeline, the evidence, the confession, would now be tested in court. Tanner Lynn Horner was formally charged in connection with the death of Athena Strand. The charges were serious: capital murder, a charge that under Texas law carries the possibility of the most severe penalties, including life without parole or the death penalty. Over time, the case progressed through the court system, hearings, filings, legal arguments behind the scenes. And then, in 2026, a major development. Horner entered a guilty plea. There would be no trial to determine whether he committed the crime. That question had already been answered. Instead, the focus shifted to sentencing. What should happen next? Because even with a guilty plea, the outcome was not automatic. The court still had to determine the appropriate punishment. And that meant presenting the case again. Not to prove guilt, but to decide consequence. Life in prison or death. That decision would now rest within the courtroom. And everything investigators had gathered, every detail, every piece of evidence, would be revisited. Not to ask what happened, but to answer a different question entirely. What does justice look like? With the guilty plea entered, the courtroom shifted into its final phase, sentencing. This was no longer about proving what happened to Athena Strand. That had already been established. Now the court had to decide what punishment was appropriate: life in prison or the death penalty. During sentencing proceedings, the full weight of the case was presented again. Investigators took the stand. They walked through the timeline, from the moment Athena disappeared to the evidence recovered from the delivery vehicle to the location where she was found. Each detail laid out clearly, methodically. The prosecution focused on the facts of the crime, the abduction, the killing, and the decisions made along the way. The defense presented its own arguments, including information about Tanner Lynn Horner and his background. Context, they argued, should be considered in sentencing. And then Athena's family spoke about who she was, about the life she should have had, about the loss that could never be measured in a courtroom. The atmosphere shifted, because beyond the evidence, this was about impact, real, personal, permanent. Everything the court had heard, every statement, every detail, now led to one final decision. And that decision was getting closer. In the end, it came down to a final decision inside that courtroom. Not about what happened, but about what should happen next. After reviewing the case, hearing from investigators, and listening to both sides, the court reached its conclusion. Tanner Lynn Horner would not face the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A sentence that ensures he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. No release, no second chance. For the legal system, that marked the end of the case. But for the family of Athena Strand, there is no true ending. Because a sentence doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't bring back the moments that were taken. It doesn't restore the future that should have been. 7 years old, at home, in a place that should have been safe. What happened that night wasn't complicated. It was a series of decisions. Moments where things could have stopped and didn't. And now, all that remains is the impact. A life lost. A family forever changed. And a case that will be remembered, not just for how it ended, but for what was taken. Because some stories don't fade with time. They stay. In the evidence, in the courtroom, and in the lives left behind. Cases like this don't end with a verdict. They stay with the people who lived them. They stay in the evidence, in the timeline, in the unanswered what-ifs. Because when we talk about what happened to Athena Strand, we're not just talking about a crime. We're talking about a child who should have had a future, a life beyond that day. And that's what matters most. If this story stayed with you, share it. Because awareness matters. Remembering matters. And telling these stories accurately matters. If you want more cases like this, follow Unsaid Case Files wherever you listen. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and remember, some stories are never fully told, only unsaid.